Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're asking something that honestly sounds a bit strange at first. Could the idea of gay cruising, something we think of as pretty modern, have actually existed during the American Civil War? I mean, the Civil War feels like such a clash, right? You picture those battlefields, the huge social changes, and then this concept, but that tension, that sort of friction between then and now, that's exactly what we're going to explore today. Forget a simple yes or no. We're trying to understand how intimacy, something so personal, played out during this massive conflict.
And that's really our mission here. We want to, carefully peel back the layers of how we understand things today and really try to place same-sex encounters in the context of the mid-19th century. The language they use, the social norms. It's all different. We're not just looking for anecdotes, but the why and the how. So we've gathered quite a bit: soldiers' diaries, letters, official court-martial records, plus a lot of really solid scholarly research. The goal, like always, is for you to get those aha moments, those surprising insights, without feeling like you're drowning in information.
Okay, let's unpack this right away because the words we use are already tricky. Think about this. Gay, homosexuality, these words define identities for us now, but they didn't exist like that back then. My first instinct is no way to gay cruising, partly because gay sounds so current. Why is that distinction so critical?
That's it right there. That's the first big aha moment. The terms homosexuality and heterosexuality, they weren't even coined until about 30 years after the war. Homosexuality pops up in German around 1869, but it doesn't really hit English until the mid-1890s. And gay, as we use it today as a specific sexual identity, that's mostly mid-20th century, even if it had some earlier niche uses. So people during the Civil War literally lacked the concepts to label themselves or others as gay or straight like we do.
Wow.
Imagine feeling strong attraction, seeking companionship, even sex, but having no word, no need box for who you were because of it, only maybe for what you did.
Okay, so this isn't just about words changing. It's a totally different way of experiencing things. That's fundamental.
It absolutely is. And it's critical because it changed everything about the social, the psychological experience of same-sex desire. Same-sex acts definitely happened. Our sources make that clear, no doubt about it. But they weren't tied to this idea of a fixed inherent identity, which meant that social controls, like sodomy laws, targeted the behavior, the act. They weren't aimed at an identity group. This allowed for a kind of, a fluidity, maybe. Acts might be condemned, sure, but the person's whole being wasn't necessarily stigmatized in that all-encompassing way that came later, when the medical and psychological labels really took hold and basically pathologized an entire way of being.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. Like the difference between saying someone lied versus calling them a liar. One's an action, the other's who they are.
Exactly. One is about behavior, the other defines the person.
So cruising back then wouldn't mean looking for someone who is gay because, that idea wasn't there. It would be more like an opportunistic search for specific acts or maybe just deep companionship within the way society was already set up.
Precisely. And this is why historians sometimes use the term queer carefully as an analytical tool, not to slap a modern label on people, but to describe experiences that fell outside the standard norms of the time, without forcing our categories onto them. It respects the difference.
And what a time it was. The Civil War wasn't just battles and politics. It turned society completely upside down.
Oh, the scale is almost impossible for us to grasp. Millions of men enlisted. Millions. This left huge gaps back home. And fascinatingly, women stepped into roles they had never held before, running farms, businesses. But for our conversation, the biggest impact. These massive, concentrated homosocial environments. Think military camps, ships, prisons, hospitals. Just packed overwhelmingly with men. And some women disguised as men, we should add, all suddenly pulled out of their normal lives away from traditional family structures. The gender imbalance was just enormous in these places.
Yeah, just picture it. Your life totally changes. You're living, sleeping, eating, marching, facing death alongside hundreds, maybe thousands of other guys. The closeness born from sharing a tent, the danger, the sheer grind of it all, that creates incredibly powerful bonds.
It really does. And what's fascinating is how these cramped male-only spaces, plus the fact that normal life was disrupted back home, created conditions where same-sex relationships and encounters could just happen more often.
Yeah.
Or maybe they were just less hidden than in regular life. These relationships weren't always about some pre-existing identity. They were often driven by the situation. When your basic needs, social, emotional, even sexual, can't be met the usual way, people adapt. And we see this pattern in military history generally, right? Long separations, intense shared danger. It often leads to same-sex intimacy. The war massively ramped up the opportunity and maybe even the necessity for it, even if the identity wasn't there. And that context is absolutely key to understanding cruising then. It wasn't about finding a gay scene, it was more like looking for connection, for release within the immediate available world around you. The environment itself kind of enabled it.
Okay, so given that context, how did the law and society actually view these acts? Because that feels really different too. Before the war, you had sodomy laws, often left over from British colonial times, think Jamestown, 1607, that far back. And the penalties could be incredibly harsh on paper, even death. But here's the interesting part, actual prosecutions, pretty rare, and the death penalty, almost never used for just sodomy. Legally, it was usually about penetration, and interestingly, both people involved were seen as guilty. And yeah, some early texts even talked about female same-sex acts as a type of sodomy.
What really jumps out is how different this is from the moral panics and the medical pathologizing of homosexuality that really blew up after the 1870s. The Civil War era was kind of in between, a liminal space. Certain acts were definitely seen as sinful, absolutely. But maybe they were tolerated or just ignored if you were discreet. We even see hints of change starting before the war, like laws against cross-dressing popping up in the 1850s. It kind of foreshadows later anxieties linking gender nonconformity with sexual deviance. So this suggests that cruising during the war, searching for these encounters, might have carried less risk of being persecuted for your identity compared to later on. The focus was still mostly on the act, the potential scandal, not on defining the person's fundamental nature. It wasn't about finding the homosexuals, it was about punishing sodomy if it became visible.
Right, which leads us straight into this huge shift, what some scholars literally called the invention of sexuality. Just to repeat the key dates. Homosexuality coined in German 1869, English mid-1890s. But it's not just the word, it's the whole concept that changed everything. Starting in the 1870s, 1880s, doctors in Europe and America began writing about sexual inversion. They framed homosexuality as a kind of illness, a morbid condition, something new. And that view stuck in psychiatry until the 1970s. That's a massive change from seeing sexual acts as just behaviors to seeing them as signs of an inherent, often sick identity. And get this, the idea of homosexuality as an identity was defined before heterosexuality even became a distinct category.
It's truly profound how this impacted the actual experience of having same-sex desires. People during the war just didn't have that medical framework. They couldn't see their feelings as an identity that needed fixing. And that lack of a label allowed for a kind of fluidity, maybe situational behavior, that became really difficult and highly stigmatized once these categories hardened. Think about what came later. Britain's Labouchere Amendment in 1885, making all male homosexual acts illegal, even private ones, or the horrible sex perversion elimination program in the U.S. government in the late 1940s. These are examples of escalating control and pathologization that just weren't really there, or at least not formalized, during the Civil War itself.
So the closet, as we think of it, didn't really exist in the same way then. Cruising during the Civil War wasn't about finding a gay community or someone with a gay identity. It was about finding partners for specific acts in a world that hadn't yet labeled those acts as symptoms of an inherent pathological identity.
Exactly. Without that medical or social category for being homosexual, people experiencing those feelings wouldn't have a label to identify with.
Which would totally change how you looked for partners.
Right. You wouldn't be looking for someone who is gay, but maybe someone who is willing or available for certain acts, perhaps just in that situation. It's the later pathologizing that really created the modern closet and the intense identity-based stigma. That just wasn't fully formed during the war. It really highlights this unique sort of pre-identity fluidity for same-sex encounters back then. You can even track it in the language used over time. Before the war, it's mostly sodomy, focusing on the act. During the war, in military records, you see things like improper and indecent intercourse or scandalous conduct still about behavior. Then, after the war, 1870s, 90s, boom, the medical terms arrive. Sexual inversion, contrary sexual instinct, sexual perversion, Uranian, these are all about pathology. By the late 19th century, you get euphemisms like the love that dares not speak its name, alongside early uses of queer in subcultures, and finally the official English term homosexual. It's a really rapid, dramatic shift.
And understanding that shift means understanding 19th century homosociality. That's absolutely crucial for thinking about how cruising might have worked. Well, just to be clear, homosociality means intense social bonds between people of the same sex. Think about Victorian culture. It was full of really strong homosocial ties. You had deeply affectionate friendships between men, passionate friendships, sometimes involving sharing beds, holding hands, things that weren't automatically seen as sexual the way they might be now.
Yeah, the classic example people bring up is Abraham Lincoln sharing a bed with his close friend Joshua Speed for years. Today, that would be all over the news, right? Endless speculation. But back then, totally normal, unremarkable. And that pervasive homosocial world is key. In a time when men regularly shared beds, expressed deep affection, formed these intense emotional bonds, well, the line between platonic intimacy and sexual acts could be a lot blurrier, less rigid than it became later. This environment didn't just allow for cruising, it kind of facilitated it, but in a less obvious, more opportunistic way. Shared quarters, deep emotional needs, just being physically close, these could naturally lead to sexual encounters. You didn't necessarily need a specific gay identity or special cruising spots. The search for partners didn't need coded signals in the same way. The existing social structures, the camps, the shared beds already provided the closeness and context. So cruising then was maybe less about finding a hidden gay subculture and more about finding an available person within an already intimate male-dominated world. The sexual acts might just emerge from existing friendships or sheer necessity, not be the sole goal from the start. The whole fabric of male social life was the cruising ground in a way.
Okay, so let's really focus on those military environments now, because the Civil War's conditions absolutely seem to have fostered same-sex intimacy. Scholars have really dug into this. Thomas Lowry, in his book, The Story the Soldiers Wouldn't Tell, used all sorts of archives, court records, medical files, letters, diaries. He looked into soldiers' sex lives, and his research included discussion of what he called gay prostitution. And Irene Monroe's work also points to clear evidence of soldiers, both Union and Confederates, loving one another during the war in ways that seem to go beyond just friendship.
Yeah, these historians really bring it home that even without our modern labels, these desires and acts were definitely part of the wartime reality. It's not just guesswork. It's based on the records people left behind. Let's get into some specific examples that really illustrate this.
We have some fascinating cases that show just how differently these things could be treated. Let's start with the Union Navy often stuck in very close quarters on ships. Records show at least 3 pairs of sailors were disciplined for improper and indecent intercourse with each other in 1865 alone. One case is really detailed. Marion Chapman and Henry Harper on the USS Pinola, 1865. They were charged with scandalous conduct. 8 more. Witnesses didn't just talk about sex acts, they described them rolled up in a blanket, huddled together like man and wife, or so, and said Chapman was seen washing Harper, combing his hair, and caressing him. Sounds almost domestic, right? Both got 10 years in prison. And this wasn't maybe totally new. A Marine back in the 1850s noted that clandestine relations between seamen were not at all uncommon.
That phrase, like man and wife, is incredibly revealing, isn't it? It shows these were seen as real partnerships, not just quick flings, even as they were being condemned. Now, contrast that harsh punishment with the story of Alphons Richter, a German immigrant in the 56th New York Infantry, and his relationship with Carl Becker. Their close bond actually outlasted the war. Sources talk about them sharing chores, caring for each other when sick, deep emotional ties. There's even a story of a tearful embrace when Becker was thought dead but turned up alive. And crucially, their relationship seems to have been known and accepted by their families and friends after the war.
Wow, what a difference. Navy punishment versus Army acceptance, seemingly.
It highlights such a complex picture. Why the difference? Maybe Navy rules were stricter, or acts were just more visible on a cramped ship versus a sprawling Army camp. Or maybe it was how people interpreted intimacy versus blatant sodomy. Richter's case shows how deep male intimacy could be openly accepted, maybe even celebrated in that homosocial military world, precisely because the homosexual label didn't exist to pathologize it yet. So this implies cruising could mean searching not just for sex, but for that profound companionship. Maybe sex was part of it, maybe not. And the risks involved clearly varied depending on where you were and how visible you were. The Navy ships were like pressure cookers, maybe, more scrutiny. The Army, more spread out, perhaps allowed for more discretion.
Lowry's research also mentions gender bending and same-sex trysts in the camps. Apparently, young drummer boys, some really young, like 9 or 10, would sometimes dress as girls for camp dances or social events. And accounts suggest that intimacy between soldiers and these boy girls, as they were sometimes called, went further than just dancing. One soldier actually wrote about sleeping with a drummer boy who was dressed as a woman. It sounds like a strange kind of camp entertainment, but with real consequences.
Absolutely. And this directly created chances for same-sex encounters by blurring gender lines and basically expanding the options within those male-only spaces. It suggests that cruising in that context might have involved seeking out guys who played with gender norms or were known to be open to it, not looking for a specific type based on identity, but maybe looking for a boy-girl who offered a different kind of interaction. You could even argue the cross-dressing itself was a kind of cruising for a different role and maybe different relationships. And the fact we have records of it means it wasn't totally secret. It was part of the observable camp life, even if not officially approved.
And there's another complex layer here from academic research. People like Andrew Donnelly argue that male homoeroticism, even if not explicitly sexual, actually served a political purpose. Basically, deep male affection was used to promote things like nationalism and a shared sense of white identity. You see it in romanticized depictions of relationships, like between enslaved men and slaveholders in pro-slavery books, oddly enough, or in emotional portrayals of Union POWs as these loving male-male pairs. After the war, some fiction even used nostalgia for this kind of innocent homoeroticism as a symbol for the nation growing up.
That's a really critical insight. It shows this potentially contradictory view in society. On one hand, explicit sodomy could be punished severely. On the other, deep male affection could be celebrated, even used strategically, if it served a purpose like national unity or promoting a certain type of masculinity. So if innocent homoeroticism was okay, even useful, then maybe cruising wasn't always about finding a forbidden gay partner. Maybe it was sometimes about finding that deeply intimate male friend within the acceptable social norms. The sexual part might just develop from that bond, rather than being the main goal. It adds another twist. Cruising wasn't always just about sex. It could be tied up with emotional needs, fitting within the era's broader acceptance of intense male bonds.
Okay, but what about official military rules? Did they specifically target same-sex acts? Well, the military did try to enforce certain gender and sexual norms, no question. But their main headache seems to have been managing, quote, millions of sexually frustrated men at war. They kind of saw soldiers' sexual activity as a natural urge that couldn't be stopped, only managed. So most regulation focused on controlling heterosexual prostitution and trying to stop the spread of venereal diseases. And here's a really telling statistic. Apparently, there was only one reported case of male prostitution during the entire war. Just one.
That single case is incredibly significant, isn't it? The fact that the military was so focused on heterosexual prostitution and STDs suggests that same-sex encounters, maybe because they were less visible or less common than visiting prostitutes, just weren't the main regulatory concern. If these acts weren't linked to disease outbreaks, weren't happening in regulated brothels, or just weren't a priority, they might have been ignored unless they caused a big scandal, like those Navy cases. So while definitely not approved, same-sex acts might have faced less active policing than other sexual behaviors. This could have inadvertently created more space for them to happen. It might have made cruising in the military a bit less risky than it became later, when specific anti-homosexual policies came into force. The main barrier wasn't necessarily targeted anti-gay rules, but more general disapproval of non-procreative sex, and just the need for discretion in that environment.
Now, let's shift focus a bit beyond the battlefields to civilian life, because the war changed things dramatically there too. Traditional gender roles got totally shaken up. Women took on jobs men used to do, running farms, businesses, working as nurses, even spies. This definitely boosted confidence for many women and helped lay groundwork for the feminist movement later on, even though most women did return to domestic roles after 1865. But for our topic, this is huge. Hundreds of women actually disguised themselves as men to enlist and fight on both sides. Can you imagine the bravery that took?
It's extraordinary. And these acts of crossing gender lines didn't just let women fight, they also created unique situations for same-sex intimacy among women soldiers. General Philip Sheridan wrote in his memoirs about two Amazons, his term for women disguised as men, who developed an intimacy while serving together in the Union Army. Their biological sex and their relationship only came out accidentally when one fell into a river drunk. It really shows how hidden their lives and relationships were within the Army structure, almost a secret world within a world.
That's incredible. So women dressing as men could almost be seen as a kind of cruising itself, not just for adventure, but maybe specifically for same-sex relationships. By choosing to enter these male-only spaces, they were, intentionally or not, putting themselves in environments where same-sex relationships were much more possible than in typical civilian life. They literally picked a space that upped their odds.
And that's the key point. This gender bending was a conscious decision to enter a male world. And within that world, the chances for same-sex intimacy were just statistically higher than in traditional female roles back home. So this kind of cruising wasn't about finding a lesbian identity again. The word didn't exist like that. It was about finding a partner in a situation that allowed such relationships, often hidden under the cover of just being male buddies. The fact they were often discovered by accident, not because someone was policing their relationship, suggests these intimacies could exist, secretly, because of the war's unique chaos. It really shows how smashing gender norms during the war directly opened doors for same-sex encounters that might have been impossible otherwise. It suggests a powerful form of cruising through performance, a risky path to connection.
And it wasn't just the military where unique environments fostered intimacy. Think about prisons. Because they're confined and segregated by sex, prisons have always been places where same-sex interactions happen. Even before the Civil War, records from the 1820s mention numerous men were having sex with each other in prisons. But then, look at the change after the war. Early 20th century Southern prison records talk about men being beaten routinely for sodomy, a much harsher attitude reflecting those growing anxieties about sexual perversion. It really drives home that post-war shift.
That's right. The fact that same-sex activity was documented in prisons both before and after the war suggests these confined single-sex places just naturally create conditions for it, regardless of identity. The shift from authorities having little interest in prosecuting before the war to routine beatings afterward, that lines up perfectly with the broader trend of medicalizing and criminalizing homosexuality as an identity. It implies cruising in prisons was likely situational, driven by need, and became way more dangerous after the war.
Hospitals during the Civil War were another intense, largely homosocial space. Walt Whitman, famous for volunteering as a nurse in D.C., wrote about observing and even being part of what he called passionate same-sex friendships, with or without sexual love, that he felt bound Whitman's Americans together. His own very close friendship with John Burroughs, where they shared a bed, really shows that deep emotional and physical closeness that could happen in these settings of care and vulnerability. It's quite moving, actually.
Whitman's experiences really underline that cruising could also be about seeking profound emotional connection, care, support, which might then become physical. It wasn't always just about sex. It could be a response to the situation, the lack of other outlets for intimacy in those intense environments. These were places where basic human needs met very limited social options, leading to connections that don't fit neatly into our modern boxes.
It's also important to talk about what wasn't really happening then. The whole idea of gayborhoods, distinct, visible queer communities in cities, that came much later, mostly after World War II, tied to things like housing patterns and community organizing. Now, we do have evidence of vibrant Black queer life, drag balls in Washington, D.C., but that's from the 1880s after the Civil War period we're discussing. So that kind of visible gay urban scene we know today just wasn't there.
Yeah, the lack of evidence for modern-style cruising in cities during the war is significant in itself. It suggests that if same-sex encounters were happening in cities, they were probably much more hidden, less organized, and definitely not linked to a visible gay subculture. The fact that most historical evidence points towards camps, prisons, and hospitals as the main sites suggests these specific homosocial places were key. Regular city life was massively disrupted by the war, too. Food shortages, unrest, people constantly moving. That probably hindered any stable queer spaces from forming. So if cruising happened in cities then, it was likely very individual, opportunistic. More about finding anyone available in a chaotic environment, rather than seeking a specific identity type. This really backs up the main point. Same-sex encounters during the Civil War seem largely situational, not yet tied to a distinct public identity or the kind of cruising culture we recognize now.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together for you. While gay cruising, as we understand it today, driven by identity, really is anachronistic for the Civil War. The words, the concepts weren't there. Same-sex desires and acts definitely were. We've seen how they were powerfully shaped by those unique, intensely homosocial environments. The camps, the ships, the prisons, the hospitals, and that crucial difference between seeing same-sex acts versus fixed sexual identities was central to how people reacted, sometimes punishing, sometimes tolerating, depending on the context, how visible it was, the nature of the bond. It was just a much more fluid, less categorized world.
Absolutely. This whole exploration really hammers home how vital historical context is, and how careful we have to be about presentism just slapping our modern ideas onto the past. It's why historians use terms like queer analytically, not as identity labels for people back then, but as tools to help us talk about experiences that didn't fit the standard molds of their time. It lets us see those experiences without mislabeling them.
And here's where it gets really thought-provoking, maybe even a bit unsettling. The Civil War wasn't just about politics and territory. It was also a deep crisis in gender, partly fought over competing ideologies of sex. And that conflict, plus the Reconstruction era that followed, really shaped how sexuality evolved in the 19th century. It actually contributed to the later creation of the male homosexual as this distinct social and medical category.
That's exactly right, because the federal government, having won the war, felt it had new power, new confidence to regulate the sex lives of citizens. That set a huge precedent for the state getting involved in policing sexuality later on, often with really damaging results. So that relative freedom or fluidity we saw during the war started to tighten up as society tried to impose order again, including on gender and sex.
So the war, by cheering up old rules and throwing people into these intense homosocial settings, accidentally created a space where same-sex acts and deep bonds could happen more often or more openly than maybe before or right after. It didn't create a gay identity overnight, but maybe that period of fluidity of situational sexuality fed into the later anxieties and the scientific drive to categorize and control anything seen as deviant. So, what does looking closely at Civil War sexuality tell us about how societies build and police identities, even now? And what can we learn about the fluidity that might still exist, maybe hidden, beneath our own modern labels?